That pinch in the front of the shoulder around the collarbone area during dips, that's not tightness. That's your AZ joint getting crushed. And no, the problem isn't dips. The problem is how you are doing them. What I see over and over again are two extremes. A huge rib flare and huge rounded shoulders. A rib flare is an extension pattern, so basically our center of mass is protruded forward in space. What does that mean? The whole posterior chain is engaged. We've got compression on the back side of the body. We're flaring the front side of the body. So the lower ribs are poking out, the sternum is raised, and usually that comes with full body extension, so primarily extension through the lumbar and thoracic spine. When we're talking about rounded shoulders, that's the exact opposite, right? Someone's shoulders are rounded forward, the six-pack abs are turned on, the sternum is pinned down, the shoulders are elevated and protracted. And both of these movements look different, obviously, but they do have a similar outcome, and in the long term they will restrict shoulder motion in some regard. But this is an important thing. For the shoulder to function properly, the scapula needs space on the rib cage. So the rib cage shouldn't be protruded forward. We don't want to have flared ribs, a pinned down sternum, overly rounded shoulders, or a scapula that is pinned back and down, right? The rib cage is the platform where the shoulder blades move on. If you flare the ribs too much, you'll restrict the motion of the scapula. So the scapula won't be able to upwardly rotate and posteriorly tilt on the rib cage because there is no space for the scapula to glide on the rib cage, right? For the scapula to tilt posteriorly in the end range of shoulder flexion or to upwardly rotate, there needs to be congruence between the scapula and the rib cage, right? These are convex and concave structures. So if the rib cage is pushed forward, there is no more space between the scapula and the rib cage to glide on properly. Or if you crunch the abs down too much, that will restrict shoulder extension and the posterior glide of the elbow, the humerus, right? The humerus is our upper arm bone. What I mean with that, if we're rounding the shoulders too much, we will restrict our ability to drive the elbow behind the body. And that's what you will see with all those athletes that are doing that crunchy dip technique. They're barely bringing their elbow behind the body. And either way, whether that is flaring the ribs too much or tucking the ribs too much down, with both ways you will lose shoulder options. And when the shoulder loses options, one structure has to take the price for it. And in this case, usually it's the AZ joint. That pinch you feel in the front of the shoulder around the collarbone area, that's compression, not a tightness issue. Here is the bigger problem I see with that modern crunchy dip technique. I've already touched on it when we're dealing with that round shoulder issue, that heavily protracted dip technique. What the people are doing is they're intentionally limiting the movement of the elbow. So they're restricting shoulder extension. That means the elbow barely moves back behind the body. The shoulder barely gets into extension, and as a result, the chest barely lengthens, right? And I suppose the dip is actually a chest, shoulder, triceps exercise and not just triceps dominant exercise. Okay, let's take a look at what is actually happening with these crunchy dips. What athletes will do is that they will lean forward in space with their torso without letting the shoulder to move in space, right? They keep the elbows tucked to their torso, they lean forward in space, and what they are doing is intentionally locking down shoulder movement. Okay, so when the elbow doesn't track behind the body, we're not getting any meaningful length on the pecs. If the elbow stays at the side, we're just leaning into the triceps, right? And it obviously makes a lot of sense. Over the last 2 years, with the rise of stiff elbow sleeves, people really started leveraging these sleeves, and that's how that technique actually came up. And One of the reasons why I'm actually doing this video is because people, when they do that technique for an extended period of time, they lose proper shoulder mechanics. And it's a goddamn pain to get rid of it. And that's my job as a coach. I have plenty of athletes who come to me, their shoulder is hurting, they can't do dips anymore because their shoulder literally has stopped working over the past few months simply because they've been doing triceps extension instead of proper dips. And when we're just leaning forward in space, we're leaning into those sleeves and we're not really getting any length on those pecs, what we're doing is, we're limiting shoulder movement at its finest, right? There is no shoulder extension. So the dip loses its whole purpose. So takeaway from me is, if you really want to leverage the dip in the best way possible, especially when we're thinking about long-term progress, then please start avoiding any extremes. And that is true with literally every movement that we're doing, right? It's okay to leverage the technique to competition standards, to ensure we're working within the shortest range of motion possible, to be as efficient as possible, right? In the 1RM sport, it's all about who moves the most amount of weight for one repetition. And if you're efficient, if you have a short range of motion that you need to travel through, perfect. Then you are maximizing the competition rules to your own needs. But if we're leveraging those competition rules too much and it affects our ability to actually move forward in space or execute certain movement patterns, then this is obviously something that will restrict our performance in the long run. So, as I said, we want to avoid any extremes. And instead, we want ribs that are stacked with the pelvis and the head, not flared and not crunched, a scapula that can move on the ribcage, so upward and downward rotation, anterior and posterior tilt, and a humerus, so an upper arm bone that actually can move behind the body. And that's where we see things like improved shoulder health, strength that actually carries over, or you can break through your training plateaus, and most importantly, dips stop wrecking your AC joint. If dips hurt your shoulders, it's rarely the exercise. It's the ribcage position that is killing your shoulder motion and crushing your joint. Fix the platform and then the shoulder fixes itself. Quick one for today. If you haven't done yet, please help me grow this channel by liking this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any new video. And if you need help with your own training, if your dips hurt or you just need some guidance because you're messing up load selection and you're dealing with strength plateaus already for a long time, then reach out. The link to the waitlist for my one-on-one online coaching is in the description down below. If you want to know how I work, then subscribe to my newsletter. And that's it for today. See you in the next one.